Are authors misunderstanding or misrepresenting Grimdark? I am a big George R.R. Martin and Joe Abercrombie fan, and at its best, this subgenre gives us complex characters, moral dilemmas with no easy answers, and a world where heroism was about surviving in a cruel, indifferent universe. At its worst, though, it overindulges in sex and violence for a surface-level representation of adult fiction. And the nihilism is so extreme that no thematic point is being made with the story anymore. Think of Game of Thrones in its early seasons. Characters like Ned Stark, who clung to honor in a world that didn't reward it, or the Hound, whose cynicism masked a deeply wounded soul, but somewhere along the way, Grimdark stopped being about exploring hard truth and started being about piling on suffering. Now, we get stories that confuse brutality with depth, where everyone is awful, everything is hopeless, and there's no real purpose behind the despair. It's not thought-provoking, it's just exhausting.
So, has Grimdark lost its way? I think the problem is that a lot of newer Grimdark stories focus so much on the over-the-top violence and the nihilistic worldview that they forget why the subgenre worked in the first place. Yeah, we get it, the world is bleak, but why does this bleakness matter? What does it say about power, survival, morality, and a bunch of other themes that you can explore? Without this, it just becomes misery for misery's sake, where shock value replaces substance. So, in this video, we're gonna break down what makes Grimdark great, where it started to go wrong, and how writers can bring back the depth and nuance that made the genre so complex in the first place.
Like any other subgenre, Grimdark didn't just show up one day, it evolved out of a reaction to the more idealistic, black and white morality of traditional fantasy, which to be fair was getting quite tiresome and out of touch. The term itself comes from Warhammer 40k, with its famous tagline, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." That pretty much sums up the tone. Bleak, brutal and unrelenting. But Grimdark truly gained traction in literature with works like A Song of Ice and Fire, The First Law, and The Black Company, which took classic fantasy archetypes and turned them inside out. What made Grimdark refreshing at the time was how it deconstructed fantasy tropes. It challenged the idea that heroes always win, that good and evil are neatly defined, and that a chosen one's destiny is set in stone. Instead of shining knights and wise wizards, we got morally ambiguous characters navigating worlds that were harsh and unforgiving. Power had consequences, survival had a cost, and sometimes doing the right thing only got you killed. This wasn't just about being edgy for the sake of it, it was about making fantasy feel more grounded, more human, and when done right, that kind of storytelling felt real and added real-world stakes to the fantastic. There's The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. His characters make terrible choices, but you understand why. Logan Ninefingers, a barbarian with a monstrous alter ego, just wants peace, but violence keeps pulling him back in. Jezal, a vain, self-absorbed nobleman obsessed with status and glory. Glokta, a torturer, is bitter and ruthless, but his inner monologue reveals a man shaped by pain and circumstance. These stories explore what it means to live in a brutal world, and of course we can't ignore Game of Thrones. Actions had real, devastating consequences. In spoiler alert, the Red Wedding punished the audience for believing in traditional storytelling justice. But even in this bleak world, there were moments of triumph, love and resilience. That's what made Grimdark compelling. It was about challenging our expectations and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, survival and morality.
Here's the thing though. Obviously, Grimdark was never just about making everything miserable. A lot of Grimdark stories explore themes of power and morality, survival and ideals, but best Grimdark stories don't just shove suffering in your face for shock value. They make you feel the weight of every choice, every consequence. They show you the worst of humanity, sure, but they also ask if there's anything worth holding on to in the darkness. So a good, well-written Grimdark story challenges, provokes, and lingers with you long after the story ends. And to me, that's the root of its success in the last few decades. So where did it go wrong?
Some Grimdark stories mistake being dark for being deep. They pile on suffering, betrayal and cruelty, but forget to explore why the world is so brutal. Take the later seasons of The Walking Dead. Once a show about survival, morality, and the cost of leadership, it eventually devolved into an endless cycle of misery. Characters faced death after death, betrayal after betrayal, with little meaningful reflection on what it all meant. It became violence for its own sake, without the emotional weight that made the early seasons compelling. If everything is always terrible, then the audience stops feeling anything, because nothing ever changes.
That's a real issue. Grimdark shouldn't be just bad things happen because bad things happen. There should be some narrative purpose to the suffering. Even on a meta level, it can make us ask questions. For example, what does power do to people? When does survival become cruelty? Can morality even exist in a world like this? Without that kind of exploration, it's just bleakness with no substance. Shock for shock value. And let's be real, if the audience is watching and reading and thinking, okay, so everything is awful forever, got it, then you've lost them. You have to at least breadcrumb some positivity here and there for some peaks and valleys effect, and also to keep hope alive, so the moments of awfulness can hit harder.
There's a fine line between using darkness to make a point and using it just to be shocking. Take Game of Thrones, for example. The early seasons were brutal, but the violence served a purpose. It showed the harsh reality of power and the consequences of every decision. But in later seasons, especially after they ran out of source material, the brutality became more about shock value. Think about how Ramsay Bolton's torture scenes weren't making too strong of a point about anything, or how Daenerys' sudden turn into a mass murderer felt like a twist for the sake of a twist. The show leaned so hard into trying to shock the audience that it lost the complexity and nuance that made it special. One of the biggest myths about Grimdark is that it has to be completely hopeless. But even the darkest stories need something to hold on to. Berserk is a very brutal fantasy story, but Guts' drive to keep going, his sheer will to survive and fight back, gives the darkness weight. If Guts had nothing to fight for, if he was just another miserable soul in a miserable world, the story wouldn't be nearly as impactful. That contrast is what makes it powerful.
This is something some of the modern Grimdark stories miss. If everything is awful and everyone is a terrible person, why should the audience care? If there's no hope, no catharsis, no moment where you see that something, anything, still matters, then it stops being a story and just becomes a long, miserable slog. So Good Grimdark will probably drag you through the mud, but they want to make you feel something along the way at least. They give you one thing to root for, one thread of meaning in the chaos, because without that, there's no impact, just a never-ending spiral of suffering and backstabbing, and honestly, who wants to sit through that? Another big problem for me is if the story has no moral anchor, it has no meaning. In a setting where everyone is selfish, corrupt, or morally gray, then right and wrong lose all weight and doesn't mean anything. Conflict becomes less about moral dilemmas and more about who's the more cunning or brutal. While Grimdark often prides itself from avoiding clear-cut heroes and villains, and this is often a good thing, the best stories still establish moral contrast, giving the audience something to hold on to. Even if the moral anchor is challenged and ultimately fails, without this contrast, Grimdark risks becoming muddled and static, a bleak, never-ending cycle of self-serving characters making selfish choices in a world where nothing really matters beyond survival and their own self-interest. If there's no tension between different worldviews and philosophies, then what separates a character's actions from another? If every decision boils down to might makes right, then is the story even saying anything?
A Song of Ice and Fire is a perfect example of both Grimdark done right and where it can go wrong. In the early books, characters like Ned Stark and Jon Snow served as moral anchors, flawed but principled men who stood against corruption, making the story not just a cynical look at power, but an examination of whether honor can survive in a ruthless world. However, as the series progresses, those anchors disappear and nearly every major character is morally compromised to some degree. With no one left representing an opposing viewpoint, the story increasingly leans into nihilism, suggesting that everyone is doomed to be consumed by power, betrayal, or cruelty. But if everyone is morally grey, then no one is, because morality ceases to be a defining factor in character conflict. I also wonder if this reason may be contributing to George's difficulty to finish the series. If everything is morally ambiguous and muddled, is it even possible to end the series with a strong point being made about anything at this point? The best grimdark stories don't erase morality. They challenge it, creating tension between ideals and reality instead of simply asserting that everything sucks, and that's just the way it is. Darkness in storytelling isn't the problem. Meaningless darkness is. The best grimdark use suffering to reinforce their themes. Take The Last of Us Part 2, 2020. It's one of the most brutal and emotionally exhausting stories in gaming, but it's not just dark for the sake of being edgy. It's about the cycle of revenge, how violence consumes people, and how even justified actions can have devastating consequences. Every horrible thing that happens in the game ties back to that central theme. Now compare that to something like Raised by Wolves. It has a grim, bleak world filled with suffering, but the story often meanders, throwing in more brutality without necessarily reinforcing a core theme.
That's what modern Grimdark is to remember. Before adding another big plot twist, ask, does this moment serve the story, or is it just here to be shocking? You're not gonna write the next Red Wedding. Darkness works best when it highlights the fight against it. If there's no struggle, if the answer is just everything is horrible, deal with it, then what's the point? Darkness is interesting when it's being used as an obstacle to challenge the characters, force them to make impossible choices, and show us why the world is brutal, not just that it is.
Grimdark works best when there's something to break up the bleakness, even if it's just a moment of levity or a fleeting sense of hope. Arcane, for example, is packed with war, betrayal, and suffering, but it also has deeply human moments, friendships, love, and moments of personal triumph. Vi and Caitlyn's growing relationship provides a sliver of warmth in a world tearing itself apart. Even in its most brutal moments, Arcane knows when to slow down and remind us what's at stake. Contrast that with something like The Bastard Son and the Devil himself, a Netflix grimdark fantasy that leans so hard into misery that it barely gave the audience anything to hold on to. Without those moments of hope, the darkness starts to feel repetitive and numbing.
One of the biggest reasons grimdark stories fall flat is when the characters have no control over their fate, when they're just being dragged along by an uncaring world with no chance to push back. So it's always good to give your characters some sort of agency. Even in the face of inevitable failure, you can still explore their choices.
Now compare that to something like The Northman, 2022. It's a beautifully shot film with a grim and brutal world, but its main character, Amleth, is so bound by fate and prophecy that his actions feel less like choices and more like inevitability.
Happy endings aren't an absolute must, but audiences do need stories where choices matter though. If the characters' decisions never change anything, if their actions are meaningless in the face of all-consuming bleakness, then why should we even care? Grimdark doesn't mean hopelessness, it means earned hope. Even if the world is cruel, even if the odds are impossible, the struggle itself is what makes the story work. Because if your characters believe in something, even when the world tells them not to, then the audience will.
Not all modern, grimdark stories have fallen into the trap of misery for misery's sake. Some authors are bringing back depth, purpose, and contrast, moving away from pure nihilism towards something that some call noble grimdark. These stories still have brutality, corruption, and suffering, but they also allow for moments of hope, loyalty, or resistance against the darkness. Books like Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, The Empire of the Wolf by Richard Swan, and The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang all incorporate grimdark elements, but they also give us characters who fight for something, even if they don't always win. They show that darkness means more when there's something standing against it. Grimdark isn't bad, it just works best when it has layers. Instead of throwing readers into a pit of despair with no way out, the most compelling grimdark stories challenge both their characters and their audiences to ask hard questions. Is power always corrupting? Is survival worth losing your soul? How do people hold on to their humanity in a world that constantly tries to take it from them? The key isn't to make every story lighter, it's to make them matter.
So, what do you think? Has Grimdark lost its way, or is it still as powerful as ever? What are your favorite and least favorite Grimdark stories? and why? Let's keep the discussion going in the comments, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and all the YouTube stuff. And feel free to join our free Discord server for fantasy and world building discussion. The link is on the channel page. We're waiting for you there. So see you then.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.